Occupational Therapy Program. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Health Services and Policy Research, which no longer really exists, so I don't know if that title even exists anymore, but there you have it. And I'm the academic lead for the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance. And it's in that capacity that mostly that I'm speaking today. And I'm delighted to be able to share this work with you. It started out as a workshop, and then a shorter workshop, and then a paper, and then a poster. So anyways, it's been through many iterations, and this is hopefully about the 35 minute version of it, and that will leave us lots of time for discussion. So thanks so much for joining us, and here we go. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Catherine is running the slides for me, so I don't have to fidget. Imagine if this email landed in your inbox this morning, and I'm going to give you a minute to read it and to start forming the words of your response to it. No, I don't want to hear those words because I suspect that some of them aren't very nice. This is probably, sadly, the way that most researchers approach policymakers. And as you can imagine, it's not the kind of approach that engenders a very positive response. This talk originated, or this idea originated a few years ago, a couple of years ago, I guess now, when I was invited to chair a panel of senior level policymakers, deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers, at a conference of disability studies researchers. And this session was meant to hear the experiences of those policymakers in their interactions with researchers, and for the researchers in the room to learn from those experiences. And out of that, we distilled some of the messages in this paper. I will just preface this talk by saying that there was a significant amount of hostility in the room from the researchers towards the policymakers, and so we'll talk some more about that and why that might be, and how to overcome that. So if we could go to the next slide. From the remarks of those senior policymakers, we're going to the next slide. Thank you. We were able to distill these 5 barriers to effective knowledge translation from researchers to policymakers. Incorrect assumptions about who policymakers are, lack of awareness of the government's agenda and priorities. Okay, we could go back maybe to the previous one. Okay, so, all right, well, we'll just carry on then with barrier number 1. Sorry, Catherine, it's running a little bit slow on my screen. Okay, sorry. Okay, so here's the 5 barriers: incorrect assumptions, lack of awareness of the process of policy work. Okay, barrier number 1. So gotta go back one. Okay. Okay, I'll let you know when it's time to change. The 3rd barrier, lack of awareness of the process of policy work and the time frames and decision cycles associated with policy work. Okay, got a mind of its own, and I will just try to keep up with it. The first barrier is incorrect assumptions about policymakers. You have all heard the jokes, I'm sure. You know, for heaven's sake, don't look out the window in the morning because then you won't have anything to do in the afternoon, etc., etc. I invite you to just think about if you were to cast someone for the role of a policymaker in a television program, and think about what kind of a person you might cast. And I suggest to you that they'd probably be a wee bit boring, perhaps a wee bit uptight, definitely kind of risk averse, maybe a bit opportunistic, And sadly, some of the stereotypes that people hold about policymakers is that they are somewhat unsophisticated at consuming research, at understanding the nuances of research, and that they need to be educated about particular issues within their portfolio. Okay, next slide. I'm going to just take this moment while it's changing too to suggest that if you don't have your microphone muted, maybe you could do that, because I am hearing a little bit of background noise. Okay, can we go to the next? There we go. Who are policymakers? Well, first of all, we talk about them sometimes as if they are a homogeneous group, but in fact, there are 4 different kinds of people primarily in that bureaucracy, and they're different from one another, and they have different sort of interests and sensitivities. Politicians are elected officials. They are overtly, explicitly partisan. They reflect a particular political ideology and have a very particular mandate to serve their government. Advisors tend to be appointed, individuals who are appointed to advise political actors, elected officials, usually the premier and ministers. These people usually have partisan affiliations and are, appointed by the party in power to help them make the kinds of decisions that they seek to make. The bureaucracy. These people are employed. They're just regular working stiffs like you and me, and they are meant to be nonpartisan. They're meant to not express or adhere to a particular party ideology, but rather to serve the party in power. They stay in their jobs even when the government changes, in a perfect world. And they are professionals in civil service, public service. Staffers are the last group, and they are the administrative staff, the support staff that support each of those other levels, and they can be very, very helpful in terms of gaining access to the people that you want to talk to, and also helping you to figure out who's the right person to talk to. Okay, next slide. Researchers and policymakers are alike in some ways and different in other ways. They are similar to each other in that both are arguably trying to make the world a better place, or at least our particular part of the world, and very often with respect to a particular constituency, a particular group with whom they have affiliation or I want to say loyalty. Secondly, the second similarity is that both address real world problems. Both attempt to provide solutions to problems that these people, this constituency, cares about. Researchers and policymakers are also different from one another in 2 important ways. The first is accountabilities. While policymakers are accountable to their government and their ministry first and foremost, and also very significantly to the electorate, researchers are accountable to their university, their department, their profession very often. They're responsible to funding agencies, and they're also accountable to sort of abstract academic standard or expectation that they adhere to. The other big difference is sources of information. While policymakers have many, many sources of information that they have to weigh and decide the relative merit of the different voices, like media, lobbyists, opposition and critics, and the public generally, researchers typically have one main information source, and that is peer-reviewed research. We do respond to other sources as well, but that's our main source of information, standard of evidence. Okay, next slide. The other thing that's important to realize about policymakers is that evidence, that thing that we prize so very highly, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for policy change. When we produce evidence and send it to policymakers, we sometimes assume that they will go, "Oh my goodness, I had no idea. We better, get on this." But in fact, there are a number of different forces that they're having to balance. Like, for example, the political ideology of the existing government, the government's priorities and expressed agenda, other interests that they are bound to take into account, business, other groups within the public, and other people with competing priorities. Okay, next slide. The second barrier to effective knowledge translation to policymakers is awareness of the government's agenda. And I'm going to suggest that if you're serious about engaging with policymakers, reaching out to policymakers, you really need to take some time to become familiar with the world that they live in, to become familiar with the policy area that governs the research that you do. And I say in brackets, or work with someone who is familiar with it. Be familiar with the government's agenda. And the government's agenda can be found in all kinds of different places. I've listed just a few here. Their election platform, their budget document, the throne speech, website, particular reports, the media, and particularly for hot issues or sensitivities, the media is a very good source to know what's pressing for the government. And the last point I've made here is to capitalize on momentum. The government is a very big ship to turn around, and if you can take advantage of something that's already underway and position the point that you want to make relative to things that are already happening, that can be very helpful. Okay, next slide. The third barrier is awareness of the timeframes and decision cycles in government. And here are a few suggestions. This is a bit similar to what I just said about being aware of current initiatives and knowing where they're at, knowing what's underway at the moment and what stage it's at. Also being aware of the news cycles and the extent to which news cycles affect what's top of mind for people in government. Know the policy cycle and the opportunities for consultation. Timing, you can imagine if a brief arrived on your desk and it had nothing to do with the 17 things that you have on your list to get done today or this week, it would have a very different sort of meaning for you than if it arrived on your desk on the very day that you're working on this topic. And so that's what we're trying to capitalize on, and knowing what's going on with the policy cycle in the area that's of interest to you is very important. Public consultation is invited at very particular times in the policy cycle. And outside of those times, it's kind of difficult to get a meeting or to get people's attention. Be prepared to seize chances when they arise. This is one of the questions that people most often ask me. And it is, what if you're not ready at the moment when there's an opportunity? And I'm going to suggest that you take that opportunity anyways, and you speak on the basis of information from your previous research, from the literature. Take the chance when it comes up, because it doesn't come up that often. And the invitation to be involved in the policy process is sufficiently compelling that I would suggest finding something to say and saying it. Be aware of the budget cycle. And this has to do with the next point as well, which is, if you can, seek one-time funding, that's very often much easier to obtain than an ongoing commitment of funding from year to year. So knowing when budgets are being presented and when budget deliberations are happening and asking for something at the right time can make a big difference. Okay, next slide. Barrier number 4, the format of a message. We very often talk about briefing notes, and I'm going to say a little bit more about briefing notes. But the main thing is that when communicating with government, you need to be very, very specific and state the actual change you would like to see. I can't tell you the number of times I have read in student papers under implications for policy. The government needs to do more for these people, period, full stop. Well, fair enough. And the response to that from government is usually, for whom would you like us to do less so that we can do more for these people? And that is, in fact, the truth of what government is dealing with. So if you want to see a change, you need to be able to say, in the eligibility criteria for this program, we want to see the word, seniors changed to older adults and seniors, or, disabled adults and seniors. So that's the level of specificity that you that dramatically increases the probability that the thing will happen, as opposed to just saying, you need to do more, you need to do better. So I've got a couple of cheesy little sayings in here that evolved from our work with the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance, and one of them is, don't try to boil the ocean in a single pot. And it refers to the idea of doing what you can, like achieving the change that is possible and not holding out for the ultimate perfect change that's going to satisfy everyone in the entire world. I think we need to accept that we can't please all the people all the time, and do what we can, because nothing succeeds like success. And that's another one of these cheesy sayings. If we succeed at something, then it's much easier to leverage that success into another success than to try to do it all at once. Another thing that we had to come to terms with in the Disability Policy Alliance, and if you know the disability community, you will know that it is far from being a homogeneous group. Ideologically, by type of disability, by severity, et cetera, et cetera. And the tendency is to say, well, if we do this for people who have physical disabilities, then people with mental illnesses won't be very happy, or people with sensory disabilities won't be. But we have to do what we can and accept that when one wins, we all win, and celebrate those achievements and recognize that maybe the next policy initiative will favor the group who wasn't particularly advantaged by the last one. So that is a very particular philosophical position, and it takes a great deal of trust with your partners to get to that place where they can accept that when one wins, we all win. Take the low-hanging fruit. You can't walk away from an opportunity because they just don't come around that often. And so if there is an opportunity for a change, even if it's not the perfect change, take it. And finally, pick the most effective messenger. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. But if we could go to the next slide, I want to just talk a little bit about briefing notes, because I think that's the way most people think they have to approach policymakers. And the fact is that a briefing note is usually an internal document within a government, and every government has its own preferred format for briefing notes. But they all have pretty much the same headings. What is the problem? Number 2, what is the background of the problem? Number 3, what are the policy options that we can look at to address the problem? And 4, how do we weigh those policy options and come to a specific recommendation? Are we ready? I'm ready for the next slide. And a briefing note is called a briefing note because it's meant to be brief. And I'm going to suggest one page and specifically focused on the government's need, on the problem that is perceived by government. It needs to be relevant to the government's priorities. It needs to be timely for the government's agenda. It needs to be accessible. So in compelling and effective language, not in the kind of language we usually use in research and academia. However, at the same time, it needs to be rigorous. It needs to communicate that the policymakers can have confidence in your findings. It needs to be credible, coming from a respected authority. It needs to be solution-oriented. And best of all, it needs to be collaborative, created with the user so that it hits the right pressure points. Okay, let's talk about whose voice is heard, given that we're there. Two kinds of partners that we always work with in the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance: academic partners, the researchers, and consumer partners. And the reason is because they carry different aspects of the message. If we're trying to get government's agenda, the best people to carry the message are consumer partners. They have an authenticity to their voice that is much more difficult to ignore than researchers' voices. However, when communicating evidence or talking about best practices and what's in the literature and sort of a more generalized perspective, policymakers value the authority that comes from being able to speak as a researcher. Okay, next slide. The last of the policymakers very much in our day-to-day lives. We don't eat in the same cafeterias. We don't walk the same hallways. We don't get our coffee from the same coffee rooms. So it takes time and effort to cultivate those relationships. And unfortunately, it's very often time and effort that our environment doesn't particularly reward. So to a large extent, we have to do this for its own merits and because we value the intrinsic satisfaction of feeling that we've made a difference. So in a way, I'm appealing to your altruism, I guess. Relationships with policymakers tend to have a past, a present, and a future. So they are durable relationships characterized by a degree of trust and familiarity with each other's work. We need to lose the underlying hostility so often present towards policymakers. At this panel that I was talking about, as we were walking out of the room, one of the guys said to me, "Yeah, it kind of amazes me, they come to me asking for things, asking for money, asking for attention, and yet there's this palpable hostility underneath." So whatever that's about, and I think it's probably about frustration because of not, from being from these two different worlds that operate on such different time frames and different decision processes. But I think we need to work a little harder at understanding each other and losing that hostility. We need to offer policymakers something that they can use, and we need to be prepared to help them with what their government is trying to achieve. And to the extent that we go to them saying, "How can we help?" I think we will have much more success than going to them and stamping our feet and saying, "This is what we want." The best possible outcome is to be their go-to person, to be the person that they reach out to and say, "We are faced with a decision. We have two policy options in front of us. Can you offer us anything that will help us to make that decision or to present a recommendation to our minister as to which policy option we should favor?" Next slide. what policy makers want from researchers is absolutely within our grasp and right up our street, in fact, right exactly what we do. They want to know about the current state of knowledge. They want to know about best practices in other jurisdictions. They want to know local and regional statistics about the problem that they're faced with, the scope and magnitude of that problem. They appreciate if we can assist with some policy analysis, and they are most interested in evidence for or against selected policy options. Next slide. I've got a picture on this next slide of a call center, and that call center is meant to evoke in you your reaction to information that is pushed at you rather than information that you pull from trusted authoritative sources. Information that is solicited is always much more welcome than information that is unsolicited. So if you can work towards a relationship where you can provide the exact information that someone is seeking, that is obviously much more desirable. All right, I'm going to give you an example of a successful policy initiative. And it's an oldie but a goodie. It's about 10 years old now, but it's just such a good example that I keep using it, and I hope you will forgive me for how dated it is. We started out, so just to put it in context, this example arose at not too long after the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was passed. And at the time of primary care reform in Ontario, when family health teams were that government's answer to making sure that every citizen, every Ontarian had a family doctor. And are we moving towards the next slide? Okay. We started out by saying to government, our research shows, gosh, I'd like to have the next slide.
Marianne, we can see the slide. I think it doesn't come up on your screen fast enough.
You've got, okay, so you've got the slide that says our research shows. Okay, our research shows that people with disabilities receive an inferior standard of primary care because they can't be examined properly. That is a bold statement and demanding of attention. But we were confident of it. It was based on about 10 years worth of research in this area of access to primary care for people with disabilities. We were able to say from our own research that one of the most significant barriers to primary care for people with disabilities is the absence of adjustable exam tables and ceiling track lists to get people onto the tables, and that only about 18% of the practices we surveyed in Eastern Ontario were capable of getting a person with a disability onto an exam table. Okay, next slide. So we worked with the Government of Ontario, the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, to get them to ensure funding for adjustable exam tables and ceiling track lifts in all 200 family health teams in Ontario. Family health teams were a flagship program of that government, and yet many of them were not accessible to people with disabilities. And so we approached them saying, here's what our research shows, and it would be so easy to, just allow them to purchase this equipment in the next budget cycle. We used their own legislation, the AODA, to convince them to take leadership on this issue. We made our case based on Ontario survey data. We provided detailed specs of made in Canada CSA approved equipment. We kind of did all the thinking for them. It's not to say they can't do their own thinking, but it makes it a lot easier for them to act if they don't have to do all the research themselves. And we approach them in a collaborative way, saying, you know, we know what the right thing to do is, and you know what the right thing to do is. So let's do it together and make everybody happy. Next slide. The reason that I use this example is because it has all the elements of a successful policy intervention. In fact, what happened was that the executive directors of, a note went out from the primary care coordinator in the ministry to the exec directors of all the family health teams saying, if you put this item in your budget, in this budget cycle that is currently, you know, being worked on, we will approve it. And to our knowledge, 140 of the 200 family health teams sought the funding and went ahead and got the equipment. So a number of elements of its success. At the time, I was on the ministry's advisory group on family health teams, and so I knew who to call, and I was able to get them to take my call. We used a collaborative, friendly approach. We made a very specific recommendation. As I say, we did all the background work for them. We provided region-specific data based on our own research to say how big the problem was and how many people were affected by it. And we related it directly to that particular government's priorities and legislation that had been passed by that government. Okay, so I'm going to suggest to you that there are 3 steps in figuring out what you have to say to government. And the first one, on the next slide, is what is the problem? What are the most pressing problems experienced by the people your research serves? It should be expressed as their problem, not your problem. Imagine how they would say it in their own words, if you possibly can. And the fact that there's no literature on something, or the fact there's no research on something, is not a problem that government is terribly interested in. They are interested in real problems experienced by real people, and by a significant number of the people that they are responsible for. The scope and magnitude and visibility of the problem, how big of a problem is it? How does it come to the attention of government? What's the impact of the problem? What happens if we do nothing? What's happening now, and why is it still a problem? The relationship to the government's agenda, and how it fits with what is important to this government. And you'll notice that I put cost in there in kind of light gray. The reason for that is because government has its own accountants, and you're welcome to say, you know, this problem represents, you know, a burden of X number of millions of dollars to the taxpayers of Ontario. But for the most part, government has its own numbers, and they're unlikely to believe your numbers anyways. So I find sometimes people are kind of stumped by the idea that they have to use cost-benefit analysis and say, you know, government, you can save this much money by doing this. They're not going to believe you anyways. So, and that's a very sophisticated level of economic analysis that I'm certainly not, and few really are equipped to do. So I suggest not worrying about money. That's not our job. Our job is to represent the scope and magnitude of the problem, the impact of the problem, the importance of the problem for real and meaningful constituency of Ontarians, assuming we're talking about health problems. The second step in figuring out what you have to say to policymakers, on the next slide, is where does the problem live in the policy infrastructure? we need to be able to say specifically what it is we're seeking to change. So we need to know where the problem lives. And we use this saying, and it's kind of smart alecky, but here you go. The policy environment is perfectly designed to produce the problems that people experience. And what that means is that if people experience a problem in real life, it can inevitably be tracked back to a gap in policy, a failure of policy, an inadequacy of policy. You can find a home for the problem somewhere in the policy environment. And if you want government to do something about it, that's what you have to draw their attention to. The fact that there's an inadequacy in the policy environment that permits this problem to continue to exist. And finally, the next slide, what can we contribute from our research? We need to be able to express what our research findings are in a very clear and direct way. And it's counterintuitive for researchers, but we need to be able to say, our research shows that blah, blah, blah. What we tend to do is say, our research involved a multi-center observational interpretive study with purpose of sampling and psychometrically sound outcome measures, blah, blah, blah. By that point, you have lost 99.9% of the population. The only people who are interested are other researchers. Instead, what we need to be able to do is make a definitive statement. Our research shows that as I said in the example, disabled people are receiving an inferior standard of care. And I was prepared to back that up with numbers if asked, but it is a very difficult thing for researchers to do because we are trained to qualify every statement to make sure that we don't overstate or overgeneralize. And I'm not suggesting that you do either of those things, but I am suggesting that you figure out what you're prepared to say on the basis of your research and say it and not apologize for it. So that is a very interesting step, and it takes a lot of practice, but very worthwhile. Okay, next slide. The next slide is a pathway for knowledge translation to policymakers that we developed at the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance. And you can find it on our website. And it suggests the particular places where we may be able to help. And please do reach out to us if we can. On the last slide has got our website on it and my acknowledgements of the various people and places that contributed to this work. And I thank you for your attention. And I'm going to stop talking and take your questions and comments if you have them. My screen must be very slow. Feel free to unmute and ask your question live or type it into the chat, whichever you prefer.
Marianne, it's Zeta. I wanted to ask, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. I want to ask what do you suggest for making the first steps to make connections with these people? Because that's, I think, for me, that's the hardest part.
It is the hardest part. And it's the part that when people ask for our help with things, we can only help up to a point because policymakers want to have a relationship with you, not with me, with you as the content expert. But the first step is to figure out who's the right person in government. And that too can be a frustrating undertaking because people in government change portfolios quite regularly. You just get used to somebody and they get moved to another job. But if you've got a good relationship, they will generally connect you with the next person. So it's this process of figuring out where does the problem live in government and who's working on it is the first step. And I don't know that there's any particular magic to it except just noodling around on government's website and trying to figure out who's working on it. If you know anyone in government, they will almost certainly help you to find the right person, or start your path of leading towards the right person. But I mean, you have put your finger right on it. It is a challenge, particularly if you don't know one another. But then if you can have your first overture be an offer to help and just say, I commend the government on this initiative that it's taken, and it got my attention because this is exactly the kind of research that we do, and we've been doing it for 10 years, and I wonder if we could set a time to talk and see if there's any of the research that we're doing that might be helpful in your pursuit of whatever it is you're pursuing.
Marianne, congratulations on a very nice paper. I enjoyed it. I worked in government in housing for 23 years, and I must have been 20 years in before I realized essentially the roadmap that you've laid out. And I really particularly respond to the researcher's obligation to know the government the government's program and the budgetary cycle. I mean, just showing up at the wrong time it just interferes with bureaucracy. But being ahead of the cycle and knowing when you can enter it is excellent advice.
It's essential, isn't it? I mean, you think from our own perspective, if something arrives on my desk and I don't know what to do with it, it could wind up in a circular file, no matter how meritorious it is. But yeah, you kind of have to have some place to file it or some portfolio to associate it with for it to stick. Yeah.
Thanks, Marianne. I have a question too. I think as researchers, we always, it's an add-on to say how we're going to impact decisions and policy. And so I'm curious, your work with the Canadian Disability Policy Alliance, I mean, it's been going on for many years now. How are you continually engaging? Cedric asked about the initial step, but the ongoing work.
Well, most of our work recently has been with the federal government, not so much with the provincial government, because this federal government has been unprecedentedly, if that's a word, active in disability studies. And although four previous governments promised to act on disability legislation, this is the first government that didn't. And Trudeau was only in office a very short time before he designated a minister responsible for disability issues. And she's a disabled woman herself, Honorable Carl Qualtrough, and she's fantastic. So we have done a bunch of work with the federal government about this new Accessible Canada Act that passed last year. So it's very much on the same model as the Accessibility Frontiers with Disabilities Act, and intended to develop standards for accessibility in a number of federally regulated industries and sectors in Canada. So, yeah, so we have people that we keep in touch with. I'm involved with a woman from the AODA advisory committee in Ontario, and she calls me often to just sort of say, particularly to do with health-related things, to say this is what we're thinking about, and if you got anything to do. One of the interesting things that I've discovered is it's not the research I'm doing today that they're interested in. Very often it's the research that I did 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but it's my ability to draw on a body of work that is of interest to them. So I think very often when we think of translating health policy, we think of pushing out something associated with the work that we're doing today. And yeah, that's a worthwhile thing to think about, but more important is the relationship and being able to draw on a body of work. Yeah.
Marianne, there's just someone, Ansha actually had typed a question in. I'm just going to read it out. And I think your sound might be a little crackling in and out. I think people might be experiencing that. I don't know if there's any adjustments, but I'll read Ansha's. She had a question, and the place and fit in relation to participatory research. So there's a lot of variety of participatory research, and where can we place KT in the participatory research as a framework?
Well, I've turned my camera off, so hopefully the sound.
I think that's better. Yeah.
Okay, good. KT is a part of every kind of research, and arguably participatory research is a part of every KT. I mentioned before that we always work with three kinds of partners. Policy partners, so someone who can help us to understand the policy environment and what's important and what's current and what's going to make an impact. Academic partners, the researchers who have actually done the research and can speak with authority about the research, and consumer partners who can lend context and authenticity and I don't know how else to say it, but depth to the expression of the problem and why it's important and why something needs to be done and how many people it represents and all those kinds of things. So those are the kind of key underlying ideas of participatory research. So I think it's a very good fit, and I thank you for that question.
Thanks, Ansha.
Hello, everyone. This is Shikha. Hello, Dr. McColl. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that the presentation you have made today and your paper is so relevant, not just to Canada and the Canadian context, but also to the context of developing countries like India. Because having worked myself as a consultant with the Ministry of Health in India, I completely and totally relate with the steps you have laid down for connecting with policymakers and the kind of budget cycles and how it operates and what are the priorities and what is the timing of the budget cycles and where do we get the message conveyed within that whole process. I hope I'm able to translate some of this knowledge to the countries like India where this is so much applicable and relevant too. So thank you for the great work.
Thank you, Shika. And I can hear my little girlfriend in the background there.
Yes, she's there. That's why I'm opening my video because she's all over here.
Hi, John.
Hi. Okay. Marianne, what I struggle with is your comment about, and I do struggle with this because as my researcher had, is when policy decisions are made without the fulsome understanding of the evidence. So they pick the one point that may or may not work for that particular context or priority issue. And I know it's a dance, but I think as researchers, we need to be careful. And so I'm just expressing my discomfort at times.
Let me see if I understand, Joan. You're your discomfort is with policymakers making decisions on inadequate information?
Or, and I think you appropriately, now maybe I misinterpreted it, but maybe, I think you appropriately stated that they don't want to hear about the methodology and all the data and all this blah, 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 blah. They just want to know a key finding that they can use, which I agree with, but sometimes there are other key findings that need to be considered at this. It's narrowing it down to that one key message that sometimes is taken out of context with all the other evidence that is out there. And an example I can use is about nurse staffing. When they make the decisions about nurse staffing, they say they don't look at the evidence related to outcomes, levels of credentialing, et cetera, et cetera. I guess it's my frustration with working with policy makers.
Okay, I think I see. So there's a bunch of things there that
Exactly.
all
Yeah.
important points. The first one is I didn't mean to say that they're not interested in methodology, but they don't necessarily want to hear it all. What they want is to be able to trust you to give them only good information, and that you represent a level of rigor and responsibility, sort of information literacy, that they can take your word for it. And so that's the importance of that relationship, and that relationship being of some long standing. I don't really so much advocate giving them just one piece of information, but if you're trying to get their attention on a problem, you have to state the problem in a very compelling way. Like, you can't just say, so what they're not interested in is there's no literature on this, or nobody's paying attention to this, or well, maybe nobody's paying attention because it's not that important. So you really need to make the
I agree with that. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly what we say in the clinical setting: high volume, high risk, high impact. Those are the priorities you address.
Yes, and so the problem for disability researchers is we are not dealing with high prevalence populations. We are not dealing with high impact problems. We're dealing with urgent problems, but for a small group. And so we have to find a way to make those problems worthy of attention.
So that's the important context that you have to provide, right?
Yeah, and then I think we also have to remember all the other stakeholders that government has to take into account.
Yes. Yeah.
And anticipate their positions, and in helping government to have good policy relevant evidence, to realize that who they're having to argue against, what positions they're having to stoke up evidence against, or for that matter.
It was great.
Thank you for your question. It's a good one.
I'm just thinking we might just have time for one more question, Marianne. It's almost 1 o'clock here. Marianne, I just want to say thank you on behalf of HSPRI for the second round talk of the year. And just to let everyone know, the next talk will be in September, on the 8th of September. And Mike Green will be speaking on his work in First Nations and diabetes.
Thank you to everyone for coming and for your questions and your interest. And do call us if we can help.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Thanks, everybody.